bit different from the other episodes because I'm not streaming through the app Callin, which has gone out of business. So unfortunately, my podcast will no longer be broadcast to the major streaming services until I figure that out. But for now, it's going to live here on YouTube, where you guys can watch it anytime you want. I may also try to upload the video and or audio file to my Patreon, where I have edited and put up some of the first episodes of the Fasting by Fungi podcast, the early ones where I tell my origin story and stuff like that. But this episode is going to be kind of an open letter to foraging ethics and people online who like to tell other people how they should or should not harvest mushrooms. And I just want to talk about some of the concepts that are at play, some of my personal best practices, the little bit of science that is out there, and some of the sort of common misconceptions, assertions, and projections that people make. Because I deal with this on a daily basis in my comment section, regardless of how I touch a mushroom or harvest it or cook it or whatever. People are always telling me I'm doing something wrong, and even if I do the thing that people are usually telling me is wrong, if I do it the opposite way, then someone will complain that I'm doing it differently or that I don't know. It goes all over the place, and I kind of just want to have like an open discussion. I was thinking about just doing this as like a live stream and talking about it on TikTok, but I decided to actually record it and make it a podcast. So hopefully you'll hang around and listen to what I have to say. Thanks again to Northspore, who, as always, is a sponsor for me. I'm very thankful to them for being an incredible supplier of mushroom spawn, mushroom growth equipment. I recently got a whole bunch of stuff from them, like a little kind of microbial tent you can work in and keep a sterile area, a little like ethanol burner. They have all sorts of really, really cool tools for mushroom cultivation on their website, as well as a new grow tent, which is phenomenal with a better sort of built-in humidifying system and air fan feeder, all this kind of stuff. So if you're interested in growing mushrooms, definitely check out northspore.com. You can use my discount code FASTINGBYFUNGI in all caps to save 10% on your order. If you want to go real simple, you can just get yourself like a block kit and grow one of those. I think yellow oysters and pink oysters grow really well in the warmer summer months. You can also start some mushrooms now, plug them up into logs or straw, and probably have mushrooms by this fall, especially if you're doing straw. Logs can take a little bit longer. I just got my first shiitakes growing on a log that I plugged up like last April. So it's been about a year for me to get mushrooms, but I should get mushrooms for several more years. So anyhow, big fan of Northspore. They're a great mushroom company. That's all I really have to say. We're going to move on to thinking about how to harvest mushrooms, right? This is a fraught question, and foraging in general is faced with this problem of a little bit of gatekeeping, because I think people who are into foraging are rightfully worried about some of their favorite places and spots being overrun by sort of enthusiastic amateurs or people who really have no respect for the land. And I've certainly felt this before. I've gone to a spot where, I know mushrooms grow, and seen just like pieces and chunks of mushrooms everywhere, and the soil's all turned up, and you're kind of like, hey, what happened here? Or like, I went to one of my favorite spots up in Humboldt a few years ago, and this beautiful sort of big mossy mounds all over the place, and someone had gone there and just flipped all the moss up and left it open and exposed, and the moss was dying and turning brown. And this is a place where normally there's like, hundreds of little chanterelle buttons or lobster mushrooms or things like that. And so someone, whether through like malice or callousness or just ignorance, knew enough to like look in the moss or under the moss for mushrooms, but didn't have the wherewithal to like give any kind of crap about that habitat as an environment. And it was upsetting and frustrating to see. So I fully sympathize with people who have strong feelings about people foraging in their spots or, where they want to be. And instead of kind of gatekeeping it and acting like no one should forage or it's not sustainable or, any other reason that people give, I think it's better to focus on education and what we can do better sort of within ourselves, how we can teach others, how we can preach best practices that we're actually doing ourselves. And, some of what I want to go over here is sort of just like ideas that exist in society and some counterpoints to sort of the most common viewpoints that I hear people projecting online when they see me interacting with mushrooms. And I'm trying to do this with a fair bit of compassion and patience and understanding, because I think everybody comes at this from sort of the best of intentions, but sometimes the way we talk to each other isn't respectful, nor is it constructive. And so let's work together to try to understand what's actually happening and how maybe we can all have a more productive conversation that helps to protect nature and prioritize sustainability over exploitation or just over name calling, which I think is sometimes what ends up happening online, especially when it comes to mushrooms. So probably the biggest complaint I hear with foraging is when people say, mention anything to do with foraging, people will go, yeah, but is that sustainable? Is it really okay if everyone runs into the woods and just takes food from the woods? And I think that attitude is sort of just it's not a good way of looking at foraging, because it's not true, right? Foraging as a concept is something we've been doing throughout history. We've been doing it longer than agriculture, and pretty much all animals forage for their food or hunt for their food. And humans are the only ones, for the most part, that have really figured out how to do like large scale agriculture. Arguably there's a few other things that kind of like tend to their patches. There's certain types of snails that will tend to a little like seaweed patch and stuff like that. But for the most part, humans are the ones who've actually discovered agriculture. And I also want to mention that agriculture itself is not that sustainable. The way we do agriculture is pretty horrible for the environment and is not helping any natural spaces be better for the most part. There are some things like silvopasture, regenerative agriculture, integrating large animals and fertilizing land and disruption of soils and stuff using big animals to kind of mimic megafauna, which is something I'm going to come back to when we think about how to harvest mushrooms. But for the most part, agriculture is pretty awful. And so I'm not saying that foraging is like a more sustainable way of doing stuff, but we've been doing it for longer, and we could certainly do a better job of looking at agriculture and how to make that more sustainable. But this is about foraging. So let's talk about foraging and let's focus on foraging. A lot of foragers that I know, particularly in this day and age, are sort of accosted by people constantly online. If they show that they got something from the woods and they're excited about it, someone will say, well, it would have been better for you to leave that out there. Or like, I would have left it for other people to look at, or I would have left it for the animals. Or it's this very sort of like judgy, keyboard warrior type thing where people are like, they probably don't even spend that much time outside, but for some reason they're angry, frustrated, feel powerless in the face of climate change and the changes that are going on with our world and sort of the large scale extinction of species, the loss of biodiversity, rising temperatures, all these kinds of things, to which I would say those are not the individual's faults. Those are like systemic issues we have with governments and corporations, and particularly fossil fuels and the governments and companies that profit off of that. Our society profits off of that. Every company that makes billions of dollars and has tons of plastic packaging is profiting off of our environmental damage. And we need to fundamentally change our human practices to address that. But it's not really at the level of the individual, and a certain person coming back with a nice haul of morels or ramps or lobster mushrooms or whatever isn't the person causing climate change. And to my point also, like depending on how much they took or how they harvested it, also is not causing the big systemic issues that are actually impacting like the level of mushrooms and the number of species and all this kind of thing. So we could all be a little bit more kind with that feedback that we give online. And if you do see someone and your first instinct is to like tell them they took too much or they did things wrong, take a moment to look at your own biases, try to understand it, and maybe there's some jealousy there and there's some projection happening. Maybe you should learn more about that particular organism before you commented on it. Or if you do think that someone has really gone overboard, maybe try to have a conversation with them, like not in the comments where you're trying to publicly shame them, but encourage them to sort of reform their practices or think a little bit more carefully about their impacts, because certainly I see that, and sometimes like, it would be cool to see someone being a little bit more careful or cautious or respectful. But people see that in my content all the time and accuse me of, not being respectful and not, sticking with sort of the guidelines for foraging ethics. And what I will tell you is you don't see, you're not there for it, right? So you don't see what someone's doing in the woods. You could be the most careful, mushroom picker of all time, and someone else could fault you for how you're doing it just because they saw a picture of what you had at the end. So just keep that in mind. I think it's an important kind of concept, and especially when it comes to like just thinking about how we speak to each other. So foraging as a concept, like I said, has gone on through most of human history. Is there a way to do things poorly? Yes, absolutely. We made a whole bunch of animal species go extinct by hunting them to extinction. Most of the world's like big birds are no longer here. We are currently killing off all sorts of different animals. We have, we've adopted certain animals for agriculture and certain plant species because we can grow a lot of them. It's, they're amenable to genetic manipulation through breeding. And, and then we have cows and pigs and chickens, and there's still wild versions of a lot of these things, but they're very different from the ones that we've selected for. And I would argue, too, that like Agaricus bisporus, the most sort of widely cultivated mushroom in America, has also been, selected to be a specific sort of agricultural version of the wild version. So again, that goes back to like wild agarics might have some hydrazine, so you shouldn't eat them raw, but Agaricus bisporus, from everything that I've seen, doesn't appear to have any agaritine in it and can be safely consumed raw. I don't like the flavor of it raw. I don't want to eat it raw, but I think it's safe to eat raw. You might still not want to eat a whole lot of it because raw chitin can screw with your gut. Anyhow, I digress. So I was on a KQED call-in show about foraging a month or two ago, and we had at least 2 calls with someone calling and say, hey, foraging isn't sustainable, or, tell me why and how it's sustainable. And, my thought with that goes back to the role of foragers. These are people who are outside, they're walking around, they're looking at habitats, and ideally they are searching for food. And most foragers go back to the same places year after year. So they have a vested interest in finding the same thing year after year and having bountiful, plentiful harvests of that thing every year so that they have food to eat, or in some cases, money, because people do sell the goods that they forage. And I, again, have mixed feelings about that, but I'll get there. So foragers are inherently caring for the land that they're taking stuff from. And I think there's a big misconception that somehow taking things from the land offers a level of entitlement, and that nature would be better off if humans didn't touch it or interact with it at all. And I find that to be a very common viewpoint. And it has absolutely no nuance. It's like, nature is better without us. To which I would say that's completely untrue and actually has deep roots in racism, environmental racism, kind of going back to the times of when a lot of the national parks were being established, and there was native peoples living on these lands, having managed them, doing controlled burns and different versions of sort of stewardship of the land for literally hundreds, if not thousands of years. And white Americans came in and said, this is now a park. You all have to get off your ancestral lands, and this is going to be better off now that no humans are here. And if you're not familiar with the case of like wolves in Yellowstone, it's really important to have like a keystone species that's doing management of particular species within that ecosystem. And in a lot of ecosystems around North America, they were managed ecosystems by native people. And if you're confused about this, I highly recommend you read a book called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's an amazing professor, I think ethnobotanist kind of person. But it has a lot about ethics and foraging and like what is responsibility to nature, and what that looks like, and how native practices can inform our current views. So I'd say that telling people to stay out of nature is not the best way to do things. It's better to educate them, like I talked about, rather than just sort of rejecting the concept that we have a role to play in nature, because we evolved in nature. But also, to that point, mushrooms have evolved largely over the last like 150 million years, most modern species in the last like 50 million years. But human beings have only been around for, I don't know, 25,000 generously. That's bleeding back into a lot of different hominid species and stuff like that. But we're fairly recent on the evolutionary timescale. So mushrooms, for the most part, have evolved uh, with other animals interacting with them, and other ecologies, but they've evolved pretty well on their own without us being involved. But that being said, over 25,000 years, humans and hominids had made a lot of megafauna go extinct. They no longer exist because of our impact on the world. However, for the most part, most mushroom species are still around. There's certain places where humans have changed the ecosystem so much by cutting down trees, in particular, getting rid of forests, that mushrooms have all but disappeared. And not all mushrooms, but specifically like ectomycorrhizal mushrooms that are growing in association with particular tree species have disappeared because we cut down all the damn trees. It wasn't because someone over foraged an area, it was because all of the host trees for those particular mushroom species are gone because we cut down the trees for firewood, for houses, for ships, etc. And there's a sort of sadness that lives within me, and I think within all people who care about nature, to think about what things were sort of pre-industrial revolution, pre, you know, lumber mills and printing mills, and the things that really kind of made us cut down all the forest and beat back nature with fire and metal and all those things. Because wouldn't it be so incredible to go to some of the great forests of the world and see the incredible like biodiversity and fungal diversity that was before we lost so many different trees? I mean, even here in North America, we had the American chestnut, which was sort of like the giant deciduous trees of the East Coast that were like as large as redwoods. They were the sort of the old growth, the big story trees. And not only we cut down all the big ones, and then we imported a disease, chestnut blight, that killed pretty much all of them and sort of functionally made the American chestnut go extinct. It's still around, but they don't last very long and they're dying. And a similar tree disease is taking out elms and ash trees and oaks here in California. They're subtly different fungal diseases, um, but we're losing a lot of habitat, and so we're losing mushrooms and the trees that they associate with. So we do want to be aware of the things that are threatened, the impacts that humans have had. But again, it's not really at like the level of the individual, and it's not particular foragers that are causing these things to go extinct. It's like large systemic problems that we should all be aware of and all work towards. And as a forager, you can actually help the Forest Service and scientists track the spread of these diseases, possibly help them contain those diseases. If you spot like an area that's supposed to be uninfected and you see an infected tree or individual, they can come and remove it and take mitigation efforts. So there's value in having foragers out in the woods acting as that like first line of defense. Foragers are also often these days, particularly Alexis Nicole, Black Forager, Gabrielle, Cerberville, Chaotic Forager. They do a great job kind of highlighting like invasive species that we can pick and eat, so that people who are removing stuff from the environment are actively helping native plants thrive by getting rid of invasive plants that happen to be edible and often delicious. With fungi, there's less of a concern about like widespread invasive fungi, although I will say certainly in the Midwest, the golden oyster, Pleurotus citropinileus, whatever, something like that. It's the golden oyster. It's from like the Indian subcontinent, and it does not belong in North America, but it is spreading all over the place. And you know, I don't think it's that bad. It's not the worst thing that can happen, but it is displacing some native species. And in theory, it would be good to go out and pick all of it. Unfortunately, picking mushrooms doesn't really get rid of the mycelium. And I'm going to get to that too when we think about like the ethics of foraging and how you take a mushroom away from its substrate. But foragers are acting as that first line. And, I'd say that most foragers, because they have that vested interest in coming back to the same spot and harvesting from the same spot, aren't going to do a ton of damage or take too much. And there is that idea that like when you take something from nature, you should be leaving a significant portion of it. And I think this is really, really important with plants, because if you pull a plant up by the roots, it's not going to come back. If you pull a mushroom up from the roots or cut it, either way, it's probably going to come back, because that mycelium, which is like the body of the fungi, still lives in the ground or in the wood and can propagate itself, regardless of whether or not it produces spores. And sometimes the mycelium runs out of food basically, and doesn't come back. But more often than not, it will fruit again in the same spot, whether or not it has produced a mushroom. Sometimes mycelium can go dormant for a whole year because the conditions aren't permissible. So it'll form like little sclerotia, little storage tubers ready for like next season. And then when next season rolls around and the conditions are good, boom, that sclerotia will grow mycelium, produce mushrooms. That's actually what morel mushrooms do, or like how they're produced. They have to go into a sclerotial form before the mycelium will grow and produce a morel. So again, people's misunderstanding and projection that plants are fungi and vice versa is very confusing in this. And I've addressed this in a lot of other episodes, but if you uproot a plant, the plant dies. If you pick a mushroom out of the ground, the mycelium does not die. So there's a big difference there in how you harvest plants versus mushrooms. That being said, when you are harvesting anything, you want to leave behind a good portion of it in nature so there'll be more for you to come back to next season. With stuff like ramps, I'm not even going to try to touch on that, but people do have a lot of very specific like guidelines as to whether you uproot the bulb or you just take the leaf, or you only take one leaf, or you only take like certain things from like the middle of a patch, not the edge of the patch. There's a whole lot of different theories out there, and I think all of them are well intentioned. But you kind of just have to decide on your own like integrity framework, and look at the area you're foraging in. If you're foraging and there's not a lot of ramps and there's a lot of like foraging pressure on ramps, maybe it's better not to take any, in the same way that like if you're a fisherman and one of your favorite like fishing stocks crashes, you should just stop fishing them for a long time until that population recovers. Because the more you put pressure on that population, the less likely it is to bounce back. And this is happening with like abalone here in California. We just need to have an absolute moratorium on harvesting these shellfish because they're not going to come back if we forage any amount of them. And so certainly there are times when you want to say, let's just stop harvesting because the environment can't take it. There's not enough here. We need to have a threshold reservoir population for us to be able to take extras. And that's a core thing that people don't understand. But in a lot of situations, mushrooms especially, we don't really have enough data to know whether or not that's happening. But you might want to talk to a forager who's been there for 30, 40 years harvesting the same patch, and they could tell you, hey, 30 years ago, I used to get so many more than I do now. And you might say, well, it sounds like populations are declining. Maybe we should up, our regulations as to like how much people can take, or we should put some sort of framework in place. However, if that's not the case, and you have someone who's been harvesting for 30 years and they say, you know what, last year was a bum year because there was no rain, but this year's been a bunch of rain and we have a lot of mushrooms. It's not about like that year to year thing. It's just about the habitat and the particular climate conditions that lead to more or less of a certain species, right? And plants and fungi are different in the sense that like plants are pretty much always there. They physically exist. Whereas mycelium is kind of ethereal, and you can't you can dig into the soil and like, I think there's mycelium here, but you won't know what kind of mushroom that mycelium is going to produce until you see the mushroom. Whereas with most plants, you can find them and you could like unearth a bulb or some other tangible piece of the plant that tells you what kind of plant it is. So it's easier to track populations of plants than it is populations of mushrooms and fungi. So yeah, I mean, the guidelines that are out there usually say leave something like at least half of what you find, or, for mushrooms, I often say leave like a third. And really what I mean is like, leave the old nasty specimens, don't take those. Leave the really young little buttons, don't take those. They need a chance to like grow and produce some spores. And really only take the best specimens that you're going to eat and you're going to use. If there's a prime specimen but it has a ton of bugs in it, you can just leave that in the woods. That's totally okay. You don't need to take anything, in fact, but if you want to take something home to eat, make sure that you're actually going to eat it and you're going to use it, or you're at least going to dry it out, or you're going to give it to a friend. Don't just take something home and let it turn into like a moldy mess. Use it. That is core part of foraging ethics. Use it or preserve it, because otherwise you should just leave it in nature where it's going to continue to do its thing. When we think about when and how and where to harvest mushrooms, this is sort of just like a super deep topic, but I want to like get into this a little bit because the biggest debate in how you harvest a mushroom has to do with whether you pick it or you cut it. And this is an outstanding question that's been argued about endlessly online. And I think there's certain cultures that categorically think you should cut all mushrooms, and then there's other countries and cultures where they don't think about it, don't care, doesn't factor in their decision. As far as I can tell, I think like Eastern Europe and particularly Argentina seem to have a big bias towards cutting mushrooms as opposed to plucking them. Pretty much most like Asian mushroom cultures that I've seen don't differentiate between cutting or plucking. They do both. In Africa, I haven't really seen anyone going one way or the other. But it's particularly sort of like Eastern European and some South American people that have very strong feelings. And I think this might come from, I don't know, Germanic, Polish, other mushroom hunting traditions. And, maybe there's something to that because certainly there are situations where I would preferentially cut a mushroom over just picking it out of the ground or ripping it off a log. And that has a lot to do with the kind of mushroom I'm harvesting, the abundance of that mushroom I'm harvesting, and how that mushroom in particular is growing, as well as what species it is. So I don't categorically cut or pick mushrooms one way or the other. I kind of do what feels right in the situation. And from a scientific perspective, there is one 30-year study along with like a 14-year parallel study that was done. And the 30-year study was done by a Swiss Forest Institute in Switzerland. The other 14-year kind of accompanying study was done in Norway. And what's true for Switzerland and Norway may not be true for the entire world, but this is still the best data that we have with regards to whether cutting or picking a mushroom makes any kind of difference. And essentially what they saw over this 30-year period and the parallel 14-year study was that there was absolutely no significant difference at any point between cutting versus picking. They were the same. From year to year, you could see big differences in the frequency of mushrooms and the diversity of species as a function of how much it rained or what the temperature conditions were. But at no point in this like systematic 30-year study where they had like multiple plots that were being tested for either picking versus cutting versus a control with no foraging happening, and they saw no difference. If anything, there was like a slight increase in the number of fruiting bodies in the areas where people were harvesting mushrooms as opposed to the controls, although that wasn't significant. The significant difference they did note was that they had areas where the forest floor was not being compacted because people were staying on kind of elevated walkways, I believe, and then in the other part, people were walking the forest floor. And the areas that had more foot traffic had a decrease in the diversity of species. And so that was a negative thing that says that compacting the forest floor can hurt the number of fruiting bodies that comes up. Actually, I don't remember if it was diversity of species or fruiting bodies. But the mushroom is called Mushroom Picking Does Not Impair Future Harvests. It's by Egley et al. It's linked on the FAQ page of my website if you want to give it a read. And really, that's the only good data that's out there. There was some data collected by the Oregon Chanterelle project, which I believe was paid for by the U.S. Forest Service. And they also concluded that there was really no difference between cut versus pluck or picking a mushroom, except that their hypothesis with chanterelles was that cutting chanterelles as opposed to picking them might actually be harmful because they did see a slight decrease in the number of chanterelles that came up after people had been cutting them as opposed to picking them. And their hypothesis was that the cut mushroom stem left the mycelium open for infection by pathogens. And I just want to talk to, if we think about from a human perspective, for some reason it makes sense that cutting is better than picking. To some people, that's their perspective. But if we put ourselves in the place of a mushroom, as opposed to an animal, which we're looking down on the mushroom, let's think about it, right? Fungi, mushrooms in particular, are pluripotent. So basically, every cell of a mushroom could grow new mycelium, in theory, and become a new mushroom. It doesn't normally happen like that. They get moldy, they get eaten by other stuff, they get infested with bugs. But unlike humans, we can't take a piece of skin and grow a whole new human. But you can take a piece of a mushroom and grow new mycelium and then eventually produce new mushrooms. That's called pluripotency. So again, they work different than we do. Plants can do this too. You can take a piece of a carrot and regrow another carrot. It's not that unusual, but like, most animals have like determinate cells. We do have some stem cells. I don't think we have any stem cells in our body where you could grow a brand new human. All of our stem cells are somewhat differentiated to make, different blood cell types or skin cells or whatever kind of cell type they are. But again, mushrooms don't work like that. Any piece of mushroom could create new mushroom. So when we think about ripping something out of the ground, and I think a lot of people have this feeling that sort of mycelium is this like sacred thing. It's not. It's a piece of fungi. And if you break off a piece of mycelium and you put it back somewhere else where it's in good conditions, it can keep growing. And it might have just created a new individual or a new population, or better yet, spread out the mycelium, allowing it to colonize a wider area and helping to distribute it in a way that it wasn't distributed before. I do think when you pick a mushroom out of the ground, it's really important to try to protect that mycelium that you have exposed. And so usually what I do, I don't often like cut a mushroom off of the base, because I like to pick the mushroom out of the ground, look at the base, helps with identification for stuff like amanitas in particular are really important to pick them out. Matsutake, it's really important. There's plenty of mushrooms where picking the base out is an important part of identification. And for things where it's not, like a chanterelle potentially, I still like to pick it out because often there's a good amount of edible stuff on the stem that I want to eat. And what I'll do is I'll take my knife and kind of trim off any dirty parts or clip off anything that doesn't look good, and I'll throw it back in the ground. Not necessarily in the same hole, but often in the same hole, and then I'll kind of cover it up so that it's not obvious that I was there harvesting mushrooms, and that the mycelium that is exposed or was exposed gets covered up so that it doesn't dry out, because I don't want pathogens getting in there. But I think the important part there is that you are severing the connection between like the mushroom and the mycelial cord, so that there's not as much of an opportunity for pathogen to get in through the cut stem into mycelium. I don't know how real that effect is, but it's a reasonable hypothesis, and so it's something I think about. When I trim mushrooms, I tend to trim them fairly like generously. I will trim a good amount of the mushroom off and put that back on the forest floor, because I just took food away from the forest, and it's important for like the slugs and bugs and all the other things to be able to still have food to eat. So I try to trim and really only take the best part of that mushroom that I will definitely eat and use, and leave the rest in the woods. And I like to trim it often in spot, like where I harvested, if I can, or at least before I leave the woods, so that you're not like trimming all this stuff off at home and just throwing it in your yard. It's not as useful as leaving all of that fungal tissue and biomass in the forest where it would be. The other thing I want people to think about when it comes to sort of like pluck or cut debate is, there's a lot of stuff about foraging ethics where people say, oh, you should carry around your mushrooms in a like a mesh bag. And, as you move through the woods, you have the opportunity to spread a bunch of fungal spores around in a way that a mushroom isn't able to do on its own, right? You can like carry a mushroom everywhere you go and just spread spores, be like, Johnny Mushroom Seed, go all over the place. I don't personally like mesh bags because they rip up mushrooms and I find them unwieldy to deal with. I prefer like a wicker or just sort of basket, those woven baskets, but they're open. And often I will like look down in my basket and give it a little blow to, send some spores flying up and around. Or, you always see me picking up a mushroom, giving it a tap. That's going to release some spores whenever you do that. It's not why I tap mushrooms, but, it probably helps or does something. Who knows? Within the cut or pluck debate, though, I do want to talk about the case for cutting, because I just kind of gave you a bunch of evidence as to why I think like picking is at least what I do majority of the time. And specifically when I pick, I often pick boletes, because I like the little crunch they make when you pull them out of the ground. But that's a mushroom that can have a nice fatty bulbous base, and I want to trim off as much of the good part, or of the bad part, and leave the good part. And so that's part of why I pick them. I do the same thing with chanterelles because I've seen that maybe leaving the stems isn't necessarily good. Although sometimes I cut chanterelles because if you pull them and they end up breaking, then they'll fray at the end. And I do find that cutting helps them come off cleaner sometimes. But I, have mixed feelings about that, because it might actually be negative to cut chanterelles given some of the data we have. Um, and when I'm talking about picking a mushroom, I'm often picking like a singular mushroom. If there's a big cluster and I'm not necessarily planning on harvesting the whole cluster, I will use a knife to cut mushrooms off that cluster so as to not disturb the base and allow some of the smaller or other mushrooms to continue growing. That being said, when you do that, you have to be really careful, as usually any amount of cutting will disturb the base of that mushroom cluster and break its connection with the mycelial cord. And so even if you think you're cutting it off, you might just be doing as much damage as if you just rip the whole cluster out, because you're being not super careful with how you cut those mushrooms off. And for something like a honey mushroom, which is one that I've had people be like, why did you pick the whole cluster? I'm like, honey mushrooms are really pathogenic and are definitely killing the trees that they're on. So I don't feel bad about screwing over honey mushrooms because they're going to come back regardless. That mycelium is like bomb proof and super aggressive and is going to kill more trees in that area, whether or not you like gently treat that cluster of mushrooms that they produced. In fact, most of the time I rip out the armillaria clusters and throw them in the garbage because I don't want the spores to spread around in like the compost heap or something like that. So again, depends on what kind of mushroom we're talking about. If there's a big cluster of chanterelles and I'm only taking the biggest one, I will carefully use my knife and slice it off and try to leave all the smaller ones to continue growing. In theory, you can come back in a week or two and get more if someone else hasn't found your spot. And so there is a real reason to cut mushrooms in a situation like that. But what I hear from a lot of people was they say, if you don't cut a mushroom, the mushroom's not coming back. And to me, that doesn't make any sense because I've been harvesting spots for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And whether I picked or cut a mushroom, the mushrooms are going to come back because the mycelium's there. It has nothing to do with the matter or manner of harvest. And I think that comes from people's like fundamental misunderstanding of like how fungal reproduction works, and that mycelium can propagate asexually, i.e. growing, and you can just take a chunk of mycelium and put it somewhere else and it'll keep growing. So it can do that, but it's a clonal reproduction of that. When it produces a mushroom, it's producing sexual spores, which are more of a like long-term growth survival strategy for that fungi, because it's an adaptive evolutionary, rolling the dice on its genome to produce new variability and ideally new adaptability within an environment. And so spreading spores is a way to spread more mycelium, but it's not like an exact genetic clone the way that like actually mycelium growing or even asexual spores are. And so just understanding those differences I think is really important if you're going to come to like the cut versus pick debate, is even understanding how a mushroom reproduces. Because I think a lot of people have this sort of fundamental understanding like, yeah, mushrooms reproduce by spores, but they don't necessarily recognize that the mycelium is an organism unto itself, and the mushroom is really just this sort of temporary fruiting body reproductive structure produced by that mycelium, which is also able to propagate and live, on its own. That being said, I think with stuff like chanterelles, it's important every year that some of the spores go down and help sort of cement that mycelial population that is associated with the roots of that tree. And I will say, I do think there's some differences in terms of harvesting saprotrophic versus ectomycorrhizal mushrooms. And I would preferentially pick ectomycorrhizal mushrooms, so chanterelles, porcini, with a lot of saprotrophic mushrooms where the mycelium is more discrete and may actually run out of food in that particular spot if it's not being replenished somehow. That's when I'm a little more careful about cutting mushrooms sometimes. Again, it doesn't really matter. When I'm growing shiitake mushrooms and wine cap mushrooms and stuff like that, I will both cut and pick. And I haven't really seen any difference as to whether or not that block is going to produce more mushrooms. But the more damage you do to that surrounding area, sometimes it can, not produce as many fruit bodies in the exact area where your damage was done because it gets dried out. But that being said, or, maybe there was primordia there that you didn't see that are now going to grow big because you left them undisturbed. Goes back to the idea of like cutting mushrooms off a cluster. If you can see more mushrooms, you may want to cut the big one and leave the other ones to grow, because then the other amount of sort of resources that were going into that big one might start being redirected to some of those smaller ones. So there again is a reason to cut a mushroom off like a big cluster. When it comes to wood, also, I generally am going to like cut mushroom off of wood, because the more you kind of like break and shred that wood apart, it does seem like it will negatively impact the mycelium that's in that wood. Again, for something like an oyster mushroom, may not matter that much because oysters are pretty bomb proof. But for stuff like a polypore, that's when I'm much more careful and definitely use a knife because if a polypore is big, like a chicken in the woods, and it's gotten fairly large, the parts closest to the wood are going to be really tough. They're not going to be good. So if you rip that whole cluster off, you're getting a lot of inedible mushroom tissue, and you're also removing the entire mushroom from that habitat. So with something like chicken in the woods, I highly recommend using a knife to cut off like the more tender outer edges. Those are going to be the best eating parts anyhow. And if you don't take the whole thing, that cluster will probably continue to grow throughout the season, and you may be able to go back and harvest many other times. Also, when it comes to the idea of like cutting mushrooms off a cluster, especially like a big thing like chicken in the woods, again, go back to that like leave at least half or at least a third of the fungal tissue there so the spores continue to have a chance to like spread, get around, um, get into the environment and do their thing. So, that's all kind of like what's on my mind about foraging and about how to harvest mushrooms. Uh, I would just like to see people be a lot more kind to each other. And, you know, it's tricky because, like, I end up on the pointy end of people's opinions a lot. And I'm trying to get better about holding space for people's sort of emotions about, like, I feel strongly about this, but I don't actually know enough to have a real opinion, but I'm going to project my opinion at you anyhow. And try to respond to them in like a understanding manner because I know where they're coming from, but I'm also trying to help teach them. And I think that whole idea of like humans shouldn't touch nature is a complete fallacy because fungi have, in many cases, evolved to recruit animals to help spread their spores. Stuff like truffles literally smell to get animals to dig them up or get into them and then spread their spores around. I mean, when we think about the kinds of animals that do this stuff, it's rodents, it's birds, and particularly insects. Insects are a huge vector for mushroom spores, and we don't even really think about that much. It's not just wind that carries spores around, it's insects. In the case of something like a stinkhorn, it's really obvious because there's flies all over the thing covering up themselves in this sticky, gooey, nasty gleba and going off and spreading the spores around. But most mushrooms have some sort of like fly or gnat species or something that lays their eggs in them. They eat the mushroom, they hatch out, they produce a whole, generation of insects, sometimes multiple generations of insects off like a single mushroom. And so there's another good reason to like leave old nasty mushrooms because they're probably full of bugs, and those bugs are like belong in the environment. Whether or not you like bugs in your mushrooms, they're gonna be there because that's mushroom probably wants that ultimately. There are certain mushrooms that like last much longer, like polypores, hard woody conchs and stuff like that, but they're continually like pumping out spores over the time. And so some mushrooms that have less time to produce spores because they're going to mold out pretty quickly probably have a strategy just like dump as many spores as possible and rely on insects to help spread their spores around. Something like an oyster mushroom just creates huge clouds of spores all over the place, and those spores are like super aggressive. So, just thinking about the type of mushroom you have and how your personal best practices to harvest that in a way that makes sense, seems responsible, is somewhat sustainable. People see me a lot with morels, as I do tend to cut morels rather than pick them. I pick them sometimes too, but often enough they're in pretty fragile soil. So in that sense, I feel better cutting them because I'm doing a little less disruption of like burnt soil, which is pretty fragile stuff. I also find cutting morels just keeps them cleaner, so I do that. Usually, before I put any mushroom in my basket, I do trim it, sort of do a quick field dress on it and trim off any dirty parts and try to brush it off a little bit. So the less dirt you bring in your basket, the less dirty your mushrooms will be inevitably when you get them home and go to clean them. And that really does like add up over time because no matter how good of a job you did at cleaning in the field, once you get home, you're like, God, these are filthy, even though, in the field they seem completely pristine compared to like everything else that was around you. So, there's a good reason to carry like a mushroom knife that has a brush on it. I like the curved blade because I'm a lot less likely to cut myself. But I think it's really odd how people get so sort of like emotionally activated about how other people harvest mushrooms because they're taking their own personal best practices and like projecting them at others as if there was like only one right way to do it. And, again, often I'm curious because sometimes it comes from like younger people. And I'm like, well, here's a 30-year study that said there was no difference between cut versus pluck. Are you 30 years old? Do you have 30 years worth of data to actually say that? And in most cases, no. It's someone's been told by an uncle or grandfather or even just read online that you should cut mushrooms instead of pick them. And I don't think it honestly matters one way or the other. Again, as I discussed in particular situations, I do think it's better or worse to pick or cut depending on the kind of mushroom you're harvesting and the dynamics of that species in your area, how frequent they are. If you only find like one mushroom in one whole area, maybe it is better to leave it. At the same time, maybe there's a whole bunch that you're missing and you should just enjoy that one morel guilt free and just be happy that at least you got one. you know I think in situations like that, the whole sort of foraging ethics thing is difficult because you're like, hey, I'm just happy I got a mushroom or two mushrooms, and if they were all you could find, have faith that there's other mushrooms out there that you're not finding, and recognize too that like the areas where you go foraging are not all of nature, right? We often forage in places that are somewhat accessible. And I think people get really like bent out of shape sometimes when they see professional foragers having a huge haul because they think about themselves and they're like, well, I only found a couple of mushrooms in this little area. So that person must have just like decimated a habitat to get that many mushrooms. And the answer is, well, commercial foragers are fairly savvy. They're usually going to places that other people aren't going. They're hiking further. They're going, much more off trail. Often they're on, and this is the part that I feel sort of mixed about. They're on land that maybe they shouldn't be on or it might be illegal to be on. But a lot of it ends up being like logging land or BLM land. There's reasons that they're able to go there and hunt with no one really seeing them because no one's out there and they're not in like highly trafficked areas. And those commercial foragers are often, again, pretty aware of their habitat because it's their livelihood. They don't want to do something that would hurt their ability to like harvest more mushrooms next year. So they harvest within their own integrity framework, and everyone has their own personal best practices for that. Again, I do think there's times where like when someone's like, we got 100 pounds of this thing, you're like, well, what would have been cool to like maybe leave a little bit more out there, but you don't know how long they were out there. I had an experience last year where I brought back a bunch of lobster mushrooms, and I was actually scared of posting a picture because like as soon as I post a picture, someone's going to tell me that I like hurt nature by taking all these mushrooms. And predictably, as soon as that picture went up, someone was like, you took too many. And I thought back because I was laughing when I was picking the mushrooms. I was like, this is crazy. I've never seen so many lobster mushrooms in my life. There's no way that I could take enough to even like scratch the surface of how many lobster mushrooms there are out here. And also, additionally, like where I was hunting was logging land that was going to get cleared in like 2 years. So, like, really, what's the sustainable thing if it's going to get all cut down and turned into a mud pile in 2 years? And then on top of that, that land was being cleared to turn into a neighborhood subdivision. So someone was like guilting me for having taken too many mushrooms from an area that was going to be cleared for human development. And I was like, is that, to me, that seems sustainable still because it was already going to get mowed down. And that's kind of my point. It's like foragers aren't necessarily the people causing the environmental damage. They're often the ones just saying, well, I guess we're going to lose this like special spot, so I might as well grab as many as I can. And we all walked out of the woods that day, baskets completely full. None of us could carry anymore. And there was, hundreds more miles of mushrooms and trees, and we didn't even scratch that. We got to the ones that we could reach from the trail, and we spent a couple hours hunting, and we got enough and we left. We didn't like continue going or go back to the car and get more baskets. We had a good amount. We said, hey, this is good. Someone commented Karen of the woods, which I think is hilarious. That is a very common thing when people are telling you whether you should be cutting or plucking or you took too much, you're being a Karen of the woods. So I think I've kind of tried to use my best, just give you my best perspective on foraging and ethics. And there's a lot more to say, but I didn't actually take notes on this one. This has all been kind of off the cuff. And I hope that's been useful. And I hope that if you have someone in your life who has really strong feelings about like how you should forage or even the ethics of foraging, that you can send them this podcast and have a little bit more of an open discourse about it when you both have the same sort of plane of understanding and at least are coming at it from a more equitable place. And, understanding that like human beings have a role to play in nature. Foragers aren't the bad guys. I don't think there's honestly one right or wrong way to harvest a mushroom. I do think it's possible to take too much ultimately, but like human beings also are not, like individual human beings are what's causing the extinction of a species. It's global climate change, lumber companies cutting down entire forests. It's bigger issues than what sort of the individual is dealing with. And if you do have strong feelings about the way that people interact with nature, focus on education and leading by example rather than being like, a keyboard Karen and telling us all how we should be doing stuff from behind the screen of your phone while you sit inside and aren't touching grass, right? That's kind of what I have to say. So, thank you for listening. Thanks again to Northspore for sponsoring this podcast. Use Fascinated by Fungi discount code on northspore.com to save on your kits and cultivation supplies. They also have a lot of great foraging books and other stuff to help you get outdoors and experience nature. If you'd like to learn more from me, you can check out my website, this podcast. I have cool merch on my website, so you can support me by getting merch. You can also go subscribe to my Patreon, where I've been posting more kind of little travel updates and blogs. I haven't been making as much content since my cat passed away because honestly, I'm not sitting down with her in my lap and editing videos all the time. But I am excited for mushroom season coming up. I'm about to go hunt Morels tomorrow. That should be pretty cool. I am going to be up in Northern California later in May doing hopefully more morel hunting and finding some porcini. This weekend, actually, May 4th and 5th, there is a Santa Cruz Mountain Mushroom Festival, and that should be really fun. I'm going to be speaking and helping to moderate a couple panels, so you should come by that if you are in the Bay Area. But yeah, thanks for hanging in here with me. Hopefully I'll figure out a way to get these episodes onto Spotify and other streaming services someday, but for now, they're here on YouTube. So cheers to you all for listening, hanging out with me. Thank you for being fascinated by fungi. Have a good one.